Guildford Dudley briefly held the highest marital title in the English government. However, his conviction for treason triggered an immediate and total removal of his royal privileges. Stripped of all ceremonial dignity, he approached the execution block in bare feet. This final walk served as his silent admission of mortality and a strict submission to his faith. The new regime needed to destroy his legacy as quickly as they destroyed his life. They refused to provide a coffin, a shroud, or any basic funerary respect. Instead, officials dumped his severed head and mutilated torso into an open public cart. The Tudor government used this brutal public display to officially terminate his family's threat to the throne. Born around 1535, Guildford Dudley was the fourth surviving son of John Dudley, the future Duke of Northumberland, and Jane Guildford. He entered a Tudor world defined by intense political instability, where staying close to the crown brought constant, life-threatening risks. A single misstep during this era could easily lead to the legal and physical destruction of an entire noble bloodline. From birth, Guildford inherited a dangerous political legacy that deeply influenced his father's strategic decisions. This complicated history began with Guildford's grandfather, Edmund Dudley, who was a legally trained bureaucrat rather than a traditional nobleman. Edmund served as a primary financial minister to King Henry VII, managing a council that ruthlessly enforced taxes and heavy fines against the English nobility. While his aggressive financial tactics successfully filled the king's royal treasury, they came at a heavy personal cost. These actions ultimately earned Edmund the deep, lasting hatred of both the aristocracy and the general public. When King Henry VII died and the young Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, the new monarch required an immediate political mechanism to distance himself from his father's oppressive fiscal policies and appease the angry nobility. Edmund Dudley was selected as the optimal scapegoat. He was arrested, subjected to a trial utilizing the highly malleable concept of constructive treason, and executed by beheading on Tower Hill in 1510. Furthermore, the state issued an Act of Attainder, stripping the Dudley family of their wealth, titles, and legal standing. From the ashes of this public disgrace and systemic execution, Guildford's father, John Dudley, internalized a definitive lesson regarding the mechanics of the Tudor court. Survival required the total and ruthless consolidation of power. John Dudley spent the subsequent decades meticulously rebuilding the family's status. He utilized exceptional military acumen, serving with distinction in naval and land campaigns, including the Battle of the Solent and the Battle of Pinkie Clough. He navigated the lethal factionalism of King Henry VIII's later years and, following the king's death, systematically outmaneuvered his political rivals. By 1550, John Dudley had orchestrated the downfall of Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, elevating himself to the position of Lord President of the Privy Council. He became the de facto ruler of England, managing the government on behalf of the underage King Edward VI. Yet, despite his father's supreme executive power, Guildford's own position within the family and the broader state apparatus was inherently precarious. This vulnerability was entirely dictated by the rigid economic and legal systems of 16th century England. In the strict hierarchy of the Tudor aristocracy, the transfer of power, titles, and wealth was governed by the absolute law of primogeniture. This legal doctrine mandated that the eldest legitimate son inherited the entirety of the family's real estate, military assets, and political titles. ensuring that the family's power remained concentrated rather than diluted among multiple heirs. John Dudley deployed his older sons, John, Ambrose, Robert, and Henry, as active opponents of his political strategy. They were maneuvered into strategic marriages, granted prominent military commissions, and positioned within the royal household to maintain the family's influence. As the fourth surviving son, Guildford inherited a structural void. He possessed no legal claim to a grand ancestral estate, no independent financial income to sustain a noble household, and no private retainer army to command regional respect. In the mathematical calculations of his father's empire building, Guildford was classified as a reserve asset. He possessed no independent political standing and was entirely dependent on his father's provision, direction, and geopolitical requirements. He was systematically bred to be an instrument of statecraft, a living tool kept in reserve, waiting to be deployed when the administration faced a specific political emergency that required a matrimonial solution. To accurately assess the events that followed, it is necessary to correct the historiographical record regarding Guildford's actual character. Modern popular culture has heavily distorted his identity. Cinematic interpretations often portray Guildford as a violent, debauched, and arrogant young nobleman who only discovers his moral center in the final days of his life. The contemporary historical record contradicts this narrative entirely. Raised within a devoutly Protestant, highly disciplined household, Guildford was the recipient of a comprehensive, cutting-edge Renaissance humanist education. The Dudley household prioritized rigorous academic training. Guildford studied complex Protestant theology, classical languages including Latin and Greek, and classical philosophy alongside his highly educated siblings. The contemporary historian Richard Grafton, who navigated the same elite court circles and observed the Dudley children personally, documented a vastly different psychological profile. Grafton recorded Guildford as a comely, virtuous, and goodly gentleman. There is no surviving contemporary evidence to support the sadistic, predatory traits later ascribed to him by fiction writers seeking a dramatic character arc. Instead, the historical evidence points to a well-educated, physically attractive, and highly obedient teenager. His defining characteristic was not malice or debauchery, but a total absence of autonomy. He had been deprived of any opportunity or permission to develop independent political thought or agency. He was a product of his environment, a compliant subordinate in a highly centralized family structure, conditioned to execute the orders of his father without question. This ingrained obedience, combined with a total lack of practical political experience, formulated the fatal flaw that would soon be exploited during the greatest constitutional crisis of the Tudor era. The delicate political equilibrium of the Tudor state depended entirely on the biological health of the monarch. In the spring of 1553, that foundation suffered a catastrophic failure. King Edward VI, the teenage sovereign and the central pillar of the Protestant establishment, contracted a severe pulmonary illness. Modern medical historians generally identify the affliction as a virulent strain of tuberculosis, compounded by secondary pulmonary infections. As the king's lung capacity deteriorated, the political reality within the Privy Council became stark and urgent. The Tudor government was forced to confront an impending succession crisis. The legal framework governing the succession was dictated by the Third Succession Act of 1543, passed during the reign of King Henry VIII. This statute stipulated a clear chronological order. If King Edward VI died without producing a biological heir, the English crown would automatically transfer to his Catholic half-sister, Princess Mary. For John Dudley and the entrenched Protestant administration, the ascension of Princess Mary represented an existential threat. It did not merely signify a transition of executive power or a loss of political influence. Mary was a devout Catholic with strong diplomatic ties to the Holy Roman Empire. Her succession guaranteed the immediate reversal of all Protestant religious reforms. Furthermore, for the men who had actively governed the state and suppressed Catholic interests during Edward's minority, Mary's reign practically guaranteed their arrest, trial, and execution for treason. To prevent this systemic collapse, the central government initiated a radical, highly controversial legal maneuver. King Edward VI and John Dudley collaborated to draft a new constitutional blueprint. This document was officially titled the Devise for the Succession. The devise was a staggering piece of constitutional manipulation. It sought to unilaterally bypass the established statutory law of 1543. The document utilized questionable legal arguments to redeclare both Princess Mary and her younger half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, as illegitimate. By legally neutralizing the king's sisters, the devise redirected the line of succession to the descendants of Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary Tudor, the former Queen of France. Specifically, the crown was directed to the Protestant Grey family. The primary beneficiary of this new legal architecture was Lady Jane Grey. However, John Dudley understood the mechanics of statecraft. He knew that ink on parchment, even when bearing the royal seal, was insufficient to secure a new dynasty or protect his family from retaliation. To permanently lock down the Dudley faction's grip on the supreme executive power, the administration required a physical, biological anchor to the newly designated royal line. It was at this precise juncture that the Dudley family's reserve asset was activated. Guildford Dudley was abruptly removed from the background of the political stage and placed directly at its center. Guildford was approximately 17 or 18 years old. He was unmarried. The previous year, his father had attempted to arrange a betrothal between Guildford and Margaret Clifford, another royal cousin, but the negotiations had failed. Consequently, in the spring of 1553, Guildford was the highest-ranking biologically available male asset within the Dudley household. He was unceremoniously selected to serve as the matrimonial weapon. His personal desires, emotional attachments, or lack of political experience were irrelevant to the administration. He was deployed strictly to legally fuse the Dudley bloodline with the newly designated sovereign bloodline of Lady Jane Grey. Chapter 8. The Durham Place Consolidation. The execution of this strategy required an overwhelming public demonstration of aristocratic unity and financial supremacy. On May 25, 1553, the Dudley administration orchestrated a massive, coordinated display of political theater. The event took place at Durham Place, a magnificent fortified palace in London controlled by John Dudley. The state hosted a lavish triple wedding designed specifically to consolidate military and aristocratic alliances for the impending transition of power. The primary union was the marriage of Lord Guildford Dudley to Lady Jane Grey. Simultaneously, the state secured two secondary alliances. Jane's younger sister, Catherine Grey, was married to Lord Herbert, the heir of the powerful Earl of Pembroke. Concurrently, Guildford's younger sister, Catherine Dudley, was married to Lord Hastings, the heir of the Earl of Huntingdon. This triple wedding was an intense strategic concentration of military capability and royal lineage. It was designed to intimidate potential opposition and project an image of an unbreakable political coalition. The financial logistics of the ceremony demonstrated the Dudley administration's absolute control over state resources. The wedding was an overwhelming display of wealth, effectively funded by the systematic extraction of assets from the national treasury. The dying King Edward VI, deeply invested in securing the Protestant succession, authorized the release of massive quantities of state property to supply the event. The brides and grooms were outfitted with the most expensive fabrics available in Europe: cloth of gold, silver tissue, and rich purple velvet. Furthermore, the king transferred a staggering hoard of jewels from the royal treasury to the newly formed couples. Many of these items had previously been confiscated from the disgraced and executed Duke of Somerset. Historical inventories indicate that Lady Jane Grey was presented with a spectacular necklace featuring 17 massive pearls, alongside diamonds and emeralds set in intricate black and white enameled gold. The state utilized immense visual opulence to legitimize a legally questionable transfer of power. Guildford Dudley stood at the altar covered in state-funded gold, executing his assigned function as the genetic bridge between his father's ambition and the English crown. Shortly after these highly publicized festivities, a significant medical incident occurred. This event would later generate centuries of historical gossip and romanticized fiction regarding the nature of the marriage. Guildford Dudley and several prominent wedding guests fell violently ill with acute food poisoning. State records indicate that a palace cook mistakenly utilized a toxic leaf in a celebratory salad. Guildford was severely incapacitated. This period of illness delayed the physical consummation of the marriage. In later centuries, Victorian historians and novelists utilized this delay to construct a narrative of unrequited love or innocent chastity. They propagated the persistent rumor that the marriage between Guildford and Jane was never consummated, suggesting a defiant romantic refusal by the young couple to participate in their parents' political machinations. The historical record categorically dismantles this romantic illusion. The consummation of a royal marriage in the 16th century was not a private emotional milestone. It was a rigorous, highly monitored legal requirement. According to canon law and English common law, a marriage was not completely indissoluble until sexual intercourse had occurred. If the union remained unconsummated, rival political factions or hostile ecclesiastical courts possessed a legal mechanism to annul the marriage, thereby destroying the strategic alliance. Reliable historical dispatches from foreign ambassadors, corroborated heavily by intimate letters written by Lady Jane Grey herself months later during her imprisonment, confirmed the biological reality. As soon as Guildford recovered from his illness, the couple fulfilled their physical obligations. This consummation was an unavoidable, cold-blooded political necessity. It was the final procedural step required by the state. By executing this biological function, Guildford Dudley successfully locked down the union. He ensured that the Dudley faction's claim to the throne was legally secured against immediate annulment. His utility as a biological asset had been successfully extracted. The political architecture was in place. They merely had to wait for the king to expire. The biological foundation of the Tudor state collapsed on July 6, 1553. King Edward VI died at Greenwich Palace. The immediate consequence was a highly dangerous vacuum of executive power. John Dudley and the Privy Council faced a critical logistical problem. The devise for the succession was legally documented, but it was not yet militarily secured. Princess Mary remained at large. She was the primary threat to the new constitutional architecture. The government implemented a strict protocol of information control. They actively suppressed the news of the sovereign's death. The objective was to maintain the illusion of the king's survival long enough to lure Princess Mary to London under false pretenses. The state required her physical apprehension to neutralize the Catholic claim to the throne. However, the Dudley administration's internal security was compromised. Princess Mary possessed a highly efficient covert intelligence network embedded within the royal court. Before Dudley's military detachments could intercept her, Mary received accurate intelligence regarding her brother's death. She immediately initiated a strategic withdrawal. She bypassed London entirely and established a fortified command center at Framlingham Castle in East Anglia. The state's primary tactical objective had failed. The coup d'etat would not be a bloodless transition. It would require a mobilization of national forces. Chapter 12. The relocation to the Tower. With the secrecy protocol breached, the central government executed the next phase of the succession plan. On July 10, 1553, Lady Jane Grey and Lord Guildford Dudley were formally transported to the Tower of London. This relocation was a standard operational procedure for a Tudor monarch awaiting coronation. However, in the context of a disputed succession, the Tower served a dual function. It was a royal palace, but it was primarily the most formidable military fortress in the capital. It housed the National Armory, the Royal Mint, and the state's secure financial reserves. Controlling the Tower was synonymous with controlling the physical apparatus of the English government. The state orchestrated a highly visible aquatic procession down the River Thames. The objective was visual propaganda. The administration needed to project absolute stability and legitimacy to the citizens of London and the foreign diplomatic corps. Guildford Dudley walked beside his wife as they entered the fortress. He was dressed in the magnificent state garments authorized by the late king. He was surrounded by the highest-ranking military commanders and ministers of the realm. For a teenager who had spent his entire life as a redundant, powerless asset within his family's hierarchy, the sudden environmental shift was extreme. It was within the heavy, lie-guarded walls of this ancient fortress that Guildford's sheltered upbringing violently collided with the realities of constitutional power. The historical dispatches of Antoine de Noailles, the French ambassador to the English court, provide a critical operational assessment of this period. De Noailles maintained an extensive network of informants within the Tower. He reported a rapid, severe behavioral shift in Lord Guildford Dudley. Intoxicated by his sudden elevation to the epicenter of national power, Guildford began operating under a fundamental misconception. He assumed his physical union to the sovereign equated to shared executive authority. He immediately began acting as a reigning monarch. He instituted strict protocols for his own presence. He insisted on dining alone in solitary state, a specific ceremonial privilege reserved exclusively for the monarch. Furthermore, he aggressively demanded that the senior courtiers and veteran members of the Privy Council address him with the royal honorific, Your Grace. Guildford fully expected to be granted the crown matrimonial. This legal mechanism would elevate him to the status of king consort. It would grant him co-monarchy alongside his wife, giving him direct control over state policy, military deployments, and financial expenditures. Guildford had made a catastrophic analytical error. He fundamentally underestimated the intellect and the legal comprehension of his 15-year-old wife. When Guildford explicitly demanded the crown, Lady Jane Grey issued a categorical refusal. This was not a domestic dispute or a lover's quarrel. It was a profound constitutional conflict. Jane Grey possessed a brilliant theological and legal mind, refined by the most rigorous humanist scholars in Europe. She clearly understood the mechanical boundaries of the English Constitution. She informed her husband that the crown of England was not a marital asset. It was the sacred property of the state. She lacked the unilateral authority to elevate him to the kingship. She accurately argued that creating a king consort required an act of Parliament. To bypass Parliament was an act of tyranny that would instantly delegitimize her already fragile regime. Jane offered a calculated political compromise. She agreed to utilize her sovereign prerogative to elevate him to the peerage. She offered him the title of Duke of Clarence. Chapter 15. The breakdown of operational discipline. This legal refusal struck a devastating blow to Guildford's ingrained sense of aristocratic entitlement. He had been conditioned to view women as political instruments. He expected unquestioning compliance. Faced with a firm constitutional boundary, Guildford exhibited a severe breakdown in operational discipline. He lacked the diplomatic tact or strategic patience required of a seasoned politician. He bypassed the political chain of command entirely. He retreated from the royal apartments and directly involved his mother, Jane Guildford, the Duchess of Northumberland. The Duchess of Northumberland was a formidable political operator within the Dudley machine. She was equally outraged by her son's demotion. She perceived Jane's refusal as an insult to the Dudley family's supreme authority. The Duchess immediately initiated a confrontation within the royal apartments. She aggressively bypassed court protocol, berating the young queen in the presence of attending counselors. The Duchess then issued a direct order to her son. She commanded Guildford to leave the queen's bed, pack his belongings, and depart the tower entirely. She threatened to relocate him back to the Dudley family estates at Syon House. This threat presented a massive security crisis. If the husband of the new queen abandoned the central command fortress on the third day of a highly contested regime change, the optical damage would be catastrophic. It would instantly signal to the public, the foreign ambassadors, and the gathering rebel forces that the Trawl government was fundamentally fractured. In this critical moment, Jane Grey demonstrated that she was not a passive puppet of the Dudley administration. Recognizing the severe logistical and diplomatic risk of allowing her husband to leave the secure zone, she exercised her absolute sovereign prerogative. She summoned the Earl of Arundel and the Earl of Pembroke, two of the most powerful military commanders on the Privy Council. She issued a direct royal command. They were to immediately lock down the tower gates. Jane explicitly ordered the military guard to physically confine Lord Guildford Dudley within the fortress. He was forbidden from leaving the grounds under any circumstances. Guildford was physically trapped by his own wife. This intense, highly publicized confrontation laid bare his total political impotence. He possessed no independent authority to override the Queen's military command. More importantly, this incident exposed a fatal structural weakness within the core of the Dudley faction. At the exact moment they desperately needed to project an image of unbreakable unity and administrative competence to a skeptical nation, the ruling family was publicly paralyzed by infighting over titles. The machinery of the coup was beginning to stall from the inside out. The internal paralysis within the Tower of London was immediately compounded by a severe external military crisis. The state required a coordinated military response to neutralize Princess Mary's gathering forces in East Anglia. The Privy Council faced a critical logistical dilemma. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, was the most experienced and successful military commander in England. The state required his tactical expertise on the battlefield. However, his departure from the capital would leave the political epicenter and the young, inexperienced monarchs unguarded. Recognizing the severity of the military threat, John Dudley assumed direct command of the Royal Artillery and the VA Guard. On July 14, 1553, he rode out of London. This deployment created a massive command vacuum within the central government. The Dudley administration's primary enforcer was no longer present to mandate compliance among the Privy Council. With John Dudley absent, the veteran politicians of the Privy Council initiated a rapid intelligence assessment. They monitored the shifting military momentum across the counties. The data was definitive. Princess Mary was not an isolated fugitive. She was commanding a massive mobilized regional army. Furthermore, she possessed overwhelming popular support from both Catholic and conservative Protestant demographics. The council recognized that the devise for the succession was operationally dead. Maintaining loyalty to Lady Jane Grey and the Dudley faction guaranteed their eventual arrest and execution for treason by Mary's advancing forces. The political elite executed a calculated, synchronized defection. On July 19th, the Earls of Pembroke and Arundel, the same men who had sworn absolute allegiance to Jane just days prior, convened a secret summit at Baynard's Castle. They drafted a formal declaration severing ties with the Dudley administration. They immediately marched to Cheapside and publicly proclaimed Mary I as the legitimate Queen of England. The collapse of the 9 Days regime occurred within a matter of hours. The intelligence of the council's defection reached the Tower of London. Henry Grey, the Duke of Suffolk and Jane's father, commanded the Tower garrison. He assessed the tactical situation and recognized the impossibility of withstanding a siege by the combined forces of the state and the populace. To secure his own immediate survival, he executed an institutional surrender. Suffolk personally entered the royal apartments. He instructed his daughter to relinquish the symbols of sovereignty. He physically tore down the canopy of estate, the ceremonial cloth suspended above the monarch. In this precise administrative moment, Lord Guildford Dudley plummeted from the status of king designate to a high-value prisoner of the state. He possessed no personal guard to defend him. He had no established political allies. The Tower Guards, reacting to the new chain of command, immediately isolated him. He was permanently separated from his wife and transferred to secure confinement within the bell tower. The Dudley military campaign dissolved simultaneously. Upon receiving intelligence of the council's defection, John Dudley's army mutinied. Lacking financial backing and legitimate state authority, he surrendered to Mary's forces in Cambridge. The Tudor legal machinery moved swiftly to dismantle the previous administration. John Dudley was transported to the Tower. He was subjected to a formal trial and convicted of high treason. On August 22, 1553, John Dudley was executed by beheading on Tower Hill. Historical records indicate that Guildford Dudley, now relocated to the Beauchamp Tower alongside his older brothers, possessed a direct sightline to the execution grounds. He observed the physical elimination of his father. The psychological impact of this event was absolute. Guildford witnessed the total destruction of his family's operational center. The man who had orchestrated his marriage dictated his actions and controlled the entire English government, was reduced to a headless corpse by the mechanics of the state. Guildford was entirely isolated, stripped of the only protective infrastructure he had ever known. Chapter 21, The Guildhall Tribunal. The new administration of Queen Mary required legal validation for its succession. The state achieved this by formally prosecuting the remnants of the Dudley faction. On November 13, 1553, the government initiated the trial of the primary conspirators. The logistics of the event were highly structured. Guildford Dudley, Lady Jane Grey, his brothers Ambrose and Henry, and the reformist Archbishop Thomas Cranmer were transported on foot from the Tower to the Guildhall. They marched under heavy military guard through the densely populated streets of London. This transit served as a public demonstration of the new regime's absolute authority. The tribunal at the Guildhall was an Oyer and Terminer commission. The state designed the proceedings to rapidly process convictions. The specific charges levied against Guildford under the Treason Act were comprehensive. He was indicted for conspiring to violently depose Queen Mary. He was charged with mobilizing armed troops to aid a convicted traitor, his father. Furthermore, he was charged with officially honoring Jane Grey as the sovereign authority of England. The defendants possessed no viable legal defense. The prosecution presented irrefutable evidence of their actions during the July crisis. Recognizing the futility of contesting the Crown's evidence, Guildford Dudley and his co-defendants formally pleaded guilty to the charges. The presiding judges issued the mandatory sentence for men convicted of high treason. Guildford was condemned to be drawn on a hurdle to Tyburn, hanged until semi-conscious, disemboweled, and quartered. However, the execution of the sentence required the final authorization of the monarch. Queen Mary executed a specific strategic delay. She suspended the sentences. Mary analyzed the political landscape. She recognized that Jane and Guildford were not the architects of the coup. They were young, manipulated assets deployed by overambitious senior ministers. The Queen intended to establish her reign on principles of Catholic mercy and legal stability. She privately indicated her intention to issue a formal royal pardon. Her objective was to maintain the teenagers under permanent secure house arrest, effectively neutralizing them as political threats without incurring the diplomatic damage of executing royal cousins. Guildford Dudley's life was temporarily secured by the political calculations of the woman his family had attempted to destroy. He was returned to the Beauchamp Tower to await his formal pardon. The captive teenagers remained locked within the cold walls of the Tower of London. Their continued physical survival hung by a fragile, highly volatile thread. It depended entirely upon their families maintaining strict, unyielding adherence to the state's stringent parole conditions. However, Henry Grey, the Duke of Suffolk and Jane's father, executed a maneuver of staggering political incompetence. Disregarding his sworn parole and the immediate safety of his daughter, Suffolk departed London. He traveled to his estates in Leicestershire with the explicit objective of mobilizing a regional army to support Wyatt's multi-pronged assault on the capital. Suffolk's active participation in a secondary uprising fundamentally altered the geopolitical calculus within the capital. His attempt to raise troops failed miserably. He was captured hiding inside a hollow tree within days. However, his brief insurrection sealed the fate of the prisoners in the Tower. Prior to the rebellion, the state had successfully classified Lady Jane Grey and Lord Guildford Dudley as neutralized assets. They were safely contained and politically dormant. Following Suffolk's mobilization, the Privy Council immediately revised their operational classification. The Tudor state recognized a dangerous mechanical reality regarding royal succession. A living claimant does not need to actively participate in a rebellion to cause one. As long as Jane and Guildford remained alive, they functioned as viable, legitimate figureheads for the Protestant faction and any anti-Marian insurgency. They transformed overnight from manipulated pawns into permanent existential threats to the regime. Future rebels would inevitably utilize their royal claim as the necessary legal justification to legitimize armed conflict against the crown. The severe internal security crisis generated by Wyatt's rebellion was immediately compounded by overwhelming external diplomatic pressure. The cornerstone of Queen Mary's foreign and domestic policy was the strategic alliance with the Holy Roman Empire, which was to be cemented through her marriage to Philip II. The Emperor Charles V required absolute assurance that his son was not walking into an unstable, hostile environment. To manage this, he deployed his ambassador, Seaman Renard. Renard functioned as a ruthless, highly effective political operator within the English court, often bypassing the English Privy Council to advise the Queen directly. Renard recognized that the presence of alternative claimants destabilized the proposed marriage treaty. Following the suppression of Wyatt's forces, the ambassador delivered a definitive diplomatic ultimatum to the Tudor administration. He stated categorically that King Philip would not set foot on English soil, and the vital international alliance would be entirely voided until the English throne was permanently secured. To satisfy the security requirements of the Spanish crown, the English state had to execute a complete physical purge of all rival claimants. Faced with severe domestic instability and the immediate threat of losing her primary international alliance, Queen Mary was forced to abandon her policy of political mercy. The survival of her regime required the deployment of state violence. Bowing to the immense diplomatic pressure exerted by Renard and her own Security Council, Mary formally revoked the suspended sentences. She transitioned from a merciful cousin to a hardened Tudor monarch, acknowledging the absolute necessity of eliminating political liabilities. She signed the execution warrants for both Lady Jane Grey and Lord Guildford Dudley. The administrative gears of the Tudor state re-engaged to finalize the judicial process initiated at the Guildhall 3 months prior. The executions were initially scheduled for February 9, 1554, but the Queen authorized a brief 3-day stay of execution. This delay was not for legal appeals. It was an administrative window designed to allow John Feckenham, the Queen's personal chaplain, time to attempt to convert Jane and Guildford to Catholicism before their deaths. Both teenagers steadfastly refused to alter their theological positions. On the eve of his execution, facing the absolute certainty of the scaffold, Guildford submitted a formal request to the Tower authorities. He asked for permission to meet with his wife one final time. The state, confident in its security protocols and perhaps recognizing the standard human element of the situation, authorized the meeting. However, Lady Jane Grey firmly and decisively denied the request. She transmitted a message to his cell outlining her rationale. In the 16th century, individuals convicted of treason were expected to participate in the ars moriendi, the art of dying well. A good death required the condemned to display absolute stoicism, spiritual conviction, and psychological discipline on the scaffold. Jane argued that a highly emotional, tearful encounter would critically compromise this necessary psychological discipline. She asserted that maintaining strict spiritual resolve was essential to endure the horrific public ordeal scheduled for the following morning. She promised a reunion in a spiritual context, prioritizing theological fortitude over earthly sentimentality. She explicitly ordered him to prepare himself mentally for the executioner. In his final hours, stripped of all political utility, abandoned by his surviving family, and denied a final meeting with his wife, Guildford displayed a psychological resilience that directly contradicts the arrogant, unstable persona frequently assigned to him by later historians. He utilized his remaining time to conform precisely to the requirements of a dignified Tudor execution. He inscribed a brief message in a small manual of prayers. This specific book was being prepared by Jane to be sent to her Fathi, the Duke of Suffolk, the very individual whose secondary treason had directly precipitated their execution warrants. Guildford's inscription is a critical piece of historical evidence regarding his actual psychological state. It contained no expressions of rage against the state, no bitter recriminations against his father-in-law, and no defiant political statements. He simply wrote, "Your loving and obedient son wishes you long life in this world with as much joy and comfort as ever I wish to myself, and in the world to come joy everlasting. Your humble son, unto his death, G. Dudley." Having fulfilled his final social and religious obligations, the 19-year-old prisoner awaited the arrival of the lieutenant of the Tower to escort him to the physical machinery of his death. The Tudor government scheduled the executions for the morning of February 12, 1554. The state required a highly structured dual execution protocol. The administration recognized the necessity of neutralizing both political figureheads simultaneously to prevent any localized uprising. The execution logistics were strictly segregated by gender and political status. Lady Jane Grey possessed royal blood. Consequently, she was granted the aristocratic privilege of a private execution. Her scaffold was constructed within the secure, enclosed perimeter of Tower Green. Lord Guildford Dudley held no royal blood. He was legally classified as a male traitor to the crown. Therefore, state protocol mandated a public execution. The authorities directed the lieutenant of the Tower, Sir John Bridges, to escort Guildford outside the fortress walls. His destination was Tower Hill. This location provided a massive public viewing area, ensuring that the citizens of London witnessed the undisputed physical supremacy of the Marian regime. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, Guildford emerged from the Beauchamp Tower. He was transferred into the custody of the sheriffs of London. He walked on foot, surrounded by a heavy contingent of armed guards, to navigate the dense crowds gathered at Tower Hill. For centuries, prominent English chroniclers documented this final walk as a display of severe psychological collapse. Historians such as John Stowe and Raphael Holinshed characterized Guildford's final moments as pathetic. They claimed he wept uncontrollably. They asserted that the guards were forced to physically drag his trembling body to the scaffold. This specific narrative successfully cemented the image of a cowardly, weak-willed teenager in the public consciousness. However, modern historical scholarship and rigorous forensic analysis of primary documents have completely dismantled this account. The narrative of his cowardice is a historiographical fabrication. It originated from a critical translation error. Archival investigators returning to the original, contemporary Latin and French eyewitness dispatches identified the discrepancy. The original accounts recorded his fervent, continuous prayers as he walked to the scaffold. Later, Elizabethan chroniclers, either through administrative carelessness or deliberate political bias against the Dudley family, misread and mistranslated the documentation. They permanently altered prayers to tears. When this fundamental error is corrected, a highly accurate, entirely different operational profile emerges. The true events of the morning of February 12th reveal a remarkable display of psychological discipline. At the age of 18 or 19, Lord Guildford Dudley arrived at Tower Hill. He exhibited profound, quiet dignity. He had explicitly rejected the Catholic confessors dispatched by Queen Mary. He walked unaccompanied by a priest, adhering strictly to his Protestant theology to the very end. He ascended the wooden stairs of the scaffold. He executed the standard protocols required of a condemned nobleman. He calmly shook hands with the attending officials and the sheriffs of London. He did not deliver a lengthy political speech recognizing the futility of such an action. He knelt on the blood-stained straw surrounding the execution block. He clasped his hands in solitary prayer. He directed his gaze upward, asking for theological mercy. He then turned to the observing crowd. In a clear, steady voice, he gently requested that the citizens pray for his soul. He positioned himself on the ground. He laid his neck across the wooden block. He signaled his readiness. The executioner raised the heavy axe. With a single precise stroke, the executioner severed his cervical vertebrae, ending his brief and turbulent life. The judicial sentence of death had been fulfilled. However, the calculated cruelty of the Tudor state did not conclude with the physical decapitation. The administration immediately utilized his corpse as an instrument of psychological warfare. The target was his surviving wife. Standard procedure for a high-ranking execution typically involved placing the remains in a closed coffin for discreet transport. The authorities at the Tower of London explicitly bypassed this protocol. Guildford's severed head and bleeding torso were not granted immediate dignity. The executioners haphazardly wrapped the mutilated remains in a standard blood-soaked cloth. They loaded the body into the back of an open, unadorned wooden cart. The Tower authorities issued a highly specific logistical directive. The cart was not routed through a discreet service entrance. It was deliberately driven along a specific internal pathway. This route passed directly beneath the window of the Partridge House. The Partridge House was the exact geographical location where Lady Jane Grey was being held in custody. The state possessed definitive intelligence that she was stationed at the window, awaiting her own summons. This transport route was an intentional administrative calculation. It was designed to shatter Jane's carefully cultivated psychological resolve before she faced her own executioner. The 15-year-old queen looked down from the window. She witnessed the dismantled, bloody remains of her husband jolting over the cobblestones in an open cart. The sheer, visceral reality of the state's violence finally penetrated her iron composure. Eyewitness accounts recorded that she wept openly. She cried out in sudden agony, stating, "Oh, Guildford! Guildford!" The state had successfully utilized a husband's corpse to inflict maximum emotional trauma upon a sovereign threat. Less than an hour after witnessing this atrocity, Jane Grey recovered her operational discipline. She walked with astonishing bravery to the center of Tower Green and placed her own head on the block. The authorities executed a rapid, unceremonious burial. The teenage husband and wife were interred beneath the cold stone floorboards of the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, located within the tower walls. They were placed in unmarked shared graves. The state erected no monument. Their physical remains were permanently integrated into the dirt of the state prison. The Tudor administration recognized that a physical execution was only the first step in neutralizing a political threat. True state security required damnatio memoriae, the total eradication of the individual from historical memory. Perhaps the most chilling and highly successful aspect of Lord Guildford Dudley's tragedy is his absolute physical erasure from the visual record of humanity. Subsequent generations, profoundly uncomfortable with this historical void, desperately attempted to manufacture a face for the romanticized myth. Canvases like the famous Madresfield Court portrait, featuring a young man enclosed in a highly detailed ruffled collar, were confidently presented to the public as the definitive image. Yet rigorous forensic analysis definitively dismantled this illusion. The painting dates precisely to 1566, 12 full years post-execution, featuring structural fashion elements and clothing fabrics, exclusive to the trends of the 1580s. It cannot possibly be Guildford Dudley. Similarly, the Tintesfield portrait, currently held by the National Trust in the United Kingdom, was aggressively exposed not as a valid 16th century artifact, but as a purely imaginative commercial fabrication commissioned in the 19th century to satisfy the lucrative market for Victorian Romanticism. Even the heavily relied upon Roxton Abbey painting, which was once widely accepted as historical fact and deeply influenced the grand historical murals painted inside the Palace of Westminster, was forcefully invalidated by authenticators. They identified gold-embroidered clothing, featuring stitching techniques and textile patterns that simply did not exist in England until decades after his death. The Tudor regime was horrifyingly thorough. They did not merely sever his head from his body, they successfully, systematically, and permanently erased his true face from the memory of the world. The historical autopsy of Lord Guildford Dudley demands the absolute rejection of previous cultural narratives. He was neither the sadistic, power-hungry brute invented by early Marian political propaganda, nor was he the fiercely independent, defiant romantic hero manufactured by modern Hollywood films. His life represents a perfect, clinical historical tragedy. He was a victim completely crushed beneath the relentless, mechanical gears of a dictatorial state. From the moment of his birth, he was stripped of the fundamental human right to self-determination. The strict legal codes of primogeniture and the towering hubristic ambitions of his father transformed him into a biological tool. He was stockpiled as an asset, deployed to secure a constitutional coup, and expected to function without agency. When that political architecture violently collapsed, the state effortlessly converted him into a convenient bloody diplomatic sacrifice. He was executed to pave the way for an international alliance manna, led by foreign powers who possessed zero interest in his identity. The complete evaporation of his political agency, his voice, and his very face stands as history's most brutal, unyielding warning. In the high-stakes, lethal environment of absolute political power, individuals who lack the capacity or permission to govern their own existence will inevitably be utilized as disposable paving stones for the ambitions of others.